This post is about Brand Whedon, feminism, and the damage of recent allegations. So what I want to do is develop three themes. The first is thinking about Whedon as a public speaker, as an advocate, as somebody who tweets, who attends conferences, goes to all sorts of interesting places, meets all sorts of people and makes pronouncements. The second is Whedon as a producer of TV shows, films, comic books, Dr. Horrible, so on and so forth. And then the third is how these two things combine to produce what elsewhere on my blog I've described as Brand Whedon. And this is Brand Whedon that I want to think about the impact of the allegations made by Kai Cole, his former wife, about his alleged behaviour. I want to make it clear about two things I'm not doing. I'm not talking about feminism in its sort of rights or wrongs, its goodness or badness. The last thing the world needs is some middle-aged white guy talking about what feminism is or isn't. What I am doing is talking about the relationship of Whedon to feminism, or at least a perceived relationship of Whedon to feminism, and how that has been impacted by, or how Brand Whedon has been impacted by that relationship. And what I'm also not doing is making any judgment about the allegations, whether they're true or false, whether he did or didn't do them. I assume he probably did. It'd be a weird thing to make accusations of that kind if he hadn't. But the personal impact of this on the individuals involved is not in my purview. It's not something I am interested in. I've never been interested in Whedon's private life. It's his public work that I've been interested in. It's his brand. The brand of Whedon is what interests me, and I want to see if I can think through in some fashion that is helpful how we are to concern ourselves with Brand Whedon in the light of the allegations by Kai Cole. In thinking about Brand Whedon, it's, I think, fairly clear that for most people their first involvement with Whedon would have been through one of his texts. Most likely for most people perhaps Buffy, maybe Firefly, for others perhaps an Avengers movie or something of that kind, maybe for some the comic books. And I would like to come in a little while to a brief thinking about what his oeuvre has to say, if anything, about feminism as such, or whether it can be called a feminist oeuvre, and if it can, what that means, if it can't, what that might mean. But before that, I'd like to think about Brand Whedon in terms of him as a public speaker, him speaking as Whedon rather than works by Whedon. Because a lot of the way in which the recent sort of furore around the allegations has been located is that somehow the work has been reduced, or it can no longer be taken seriously or trusted, because how could a feminist act in the way that he's been accused of behaving? And as I say, I'm not really engaging with that sort of questions particularly. But one thing that is clearly the case is that Whedon has himself presented his work as feminist. I'm going to come later to whether or not I think that's fair and accurate, but he has definitely located himself as writing or producing feminist work, and as a corollary of himself as a feminist. Just three or four easy examples to start with. All these examples come from Joss Whedon Conversations, edited by David Lavery and Cynthia Burkhead. So in one interview, when asked about what's the thing that you're proudest of in this world, he says, "Art and feminism, my little show that changed things." That's the quotation, by the way, that opens my forthcoming book from Manchester University Press, although that was written long before any of this came out. Later he says, "I've struggled with my ability to write women. My whole life I've wanted to make sure that I didn't idealise them, that I just didn't sort of scratch the surface, and sometimes I don't get it right. When I don't understand, I go to Martin Oxon, one of our female writers, and ask, what did you go through? But I've always been interested in feminism, partially because I was raised by a very strong woman, and partially because being small and fragile and not taken seriously by anybody, I could identify with the way I perceived women were being treated once I got out of my house." In a different context, he says, Whedon wanted to create an iconic female hero, but also, quote, "a world in which adolescent boys would see a girl take charge of as the sexiest goddamn thing they ever saw." And finally, in a different context again, he said, "It wasn't like anybody thought I wasn't going to make Wonder Woman extraordinarily beautiful. That's part of her thing, that she's so beautiful that men can hardly bear it. I'm all about that. And power, I'm all about that. And power just makes her sexier. I certainly wasn't turning my back on her hotness just because of my politics. I think that's a common misconception about feminism in general. So what you have from Whedon is a number of pronouncements that make clear and explicit relationship between his own avowed personal politics, which he describes as being a feminist amongst other things, and his attempt to transfigure that politics into some kind of artistic form, even when it's fraught and difficult. So having Wonder Woman as being hot, and the separate but perhaps related furore around the leaking of the alleged Whedon Wonder Woman script is part of this broader debate about feminism. So Whedon thinks his work is feminist, and his work with things like Equality Now, Planned Parenthood, would also very strongly indicate that his position as advocate for feminism, if not feminist per se, is very much part of his public persona, and that is essential for Brand Whedon, for how Brand Whedon has come to be. It has helped to contextualize and to provide a whole range of tools of analysis for thinking through what we might do with Whedon's work, except that by prioritizing Whedon's own response to his own work, critics, I think, have fallen prey to a very common post-romantic misapprehension about what we should be doing as critics in relation to the author and the work itself. For a start, as anybody in TV studies will know, you can't easily ascribe the notion of author to a text. Even when with Whedon you've got him writing the script and directing, you've still got editors, and you've still got actors, and you've still got lighting technicians, and you've still got the wardrobe person, and there's scenes, the dress setter. There's so many people involved that making that direct correlation is incredibly hard. This is why I dislike auteur theory so much, and I dislike it in relation to TV theories as strongly, if not more strongly. So there's always been a problem with that. But even if we allowed the possibility that there could be a single unified creator of a televisual text, we're undertaking an incredibly and very problematic, pseudo-fascistic way of relating to that text and that author if we allow the author not just the privilege of making the text, but of then telling us what it means. If the meaning is so fundamentally prescribed by the creator, then the role of the viewer becomes incredibly curtailed. And so a preliminary disquiet I have, and have had for years about some responses to Whedon, is that somehow we should see the text as his voice, and then see the external voice of public Whedon speaking as Whedon, as somehow determining how we view the text. I shall carry on with that shortly. So far I've suggested that we need to be careful about being too sure that we can relate what the creator says about the work that they've created and the work itself, especially so when it comes to TV and film. And I've also, I think, tried to indicate that Whedon is unambiguous in asserting his own feminism and the feminism of his shows, and that has been fundamental to one way of thinking through Whedon and the construction of Brand Whedon, which is why the recent allegations are so damaging to the brand. But the question is, even if it's damaging to the brand, does it have to be damaging to the constituent different parts of that brand, which in this instance I mean his works? I think it's definitely damaging to his public persona. It's undeniably going to damage the Whedon who tweets and who makes advocate videos. That has been damaged. But does it and should it damage the shows? He claims that his shows are feminist. If for the time being we accept him at his word about that, and I think we need to be quite careful about doing such a thing, but if we do accept him as his word, then it's unclear to me that the fact that something that he has done subsequent to writing this work, or even before it or whilst it was happening, makes much difference about how we view the work. The work is what the work is. Clearly we bring to it, and everybody else brings to it, all sorts of different ways of thinking, all sorts of different theoretical lenses, all sorts of different prejudices and life histories and desires and dislikes, and a whole range and panoply of bits and pieces that go into how we interpret a text, how we feel a text, how we respond to a text. And one of the things that we might bring to that now would be a distaste for Whedon the man, and that might have an impact on how we choose to view Buffy or Firefly or Dollhouse. But it doesn't seem to be that it has to. The only direct relationship between what Whedon has done, or has been alleged to have done, and his work is that a person called Joss Whedon, who has a particular role in a particular industry, did a certain set of things, which then can be thought of as having a sort of correlation to the work itself. I think that's a very peculiar way of thinking through how we respond to, understand and work with popular culture. But it's nevertheless part of the celebrity culture that, as academics, I think we also need to be quite cautious about. And I'm not for one second trying to sort of do a holier than thou, oh, silly people with their celebrity nonsense. I cried when David Bowie died. I cried as if he had somehow personally mattered in my life because I had somehow mattered to him. It was a ridiculous response in every way other than the human way, which is I had this huge attachment to this imaginary figure that I've created through the music. I don't have the same kind of attachment to Whedon, but I can see why people would, and I can see why they would feel upset and betrayed. But I'm not really trying to think about those people. What I'm thinking about is how, as critics, we try to respond seriously to how we view the current situation. And the question which I think I've always had, which is in a sense a bigger question, is to what extent are Whedon shows feminist? Now, one of the things that is obvious about Buffy is that at the time when it came out on television, there were very few shows where you had a strong female lead who was given the complexity and demands that Buffy has and that Sarah Michelle Gellar had to have to be able to portray her. The leadership skills, the fighting skills, the depth and sense of history that she has to carry with her, and all those things absolutely there. So you've got, without a shadow of a doubt, a phenomenally strong female character. But is that sufficient for it to be called a feminist text? Maybe it is. Maybe it is. I'm not convinced that it is, but perhaps that is sufficient. But if that's what it takes to have a strong, if what it takes to be a feminist text is to have a strong female lead, then what do we then do with all the ancillary bits and pieces? Do we just sort of say, well, it doesn't matter what Glory does, it doesn't matter what the Mayor does, because the text is feminist, because it's about Buffy? It's clearly got Buffy as its major premise, and we are clearly being invited to think very carefully about different representations of relationships to gender, absolutely. And it seems a preposterous notion that you wouldn't want to address the show from a feminist perspective at times. But addressing the show from feminist perspectives because of some of its themes and characters is not, it seems to me, the same thing as calling it a feminist text in the first place. And even if Buffy is, and I'm unconvinced that it is, but even if it is, it's much less clear to me how Angel is or how Firefly is, or in a sense, probably Dollhouse, if I had to make a sort of theoretical overview claiming for one of the texts as to being a feminist. I think probably Dollhouse would be the one. But to an extent, I think I'd rather think of Dollhouse as a gender studies / queer theories text if you had to limit it in those terms. So I think there's a theoretical question which has to be asked. Is any of Whedon's texts actually feminist? If they are, and if we also think that as creator he has got a responsibility to those texts, then I can see why people might choose to take the view that they would no longer kind of watch Whedon's work or engage with any more new of his work. But I would rather think through a series of questions which would say we cannot pretend that Whedon isn't responsible for Buffy, and we can't pretend that Whedon isn't responsible for the Planned Parenthood media that he makes. There's clearly a relationship between those two components. Brand Whedon is the composite of all of these things. But we also have to be quite careful about ensuring that we disaggregate the bits that do function to inform a text and the bits that don't function to inform a text. So I think I've probably gone on for long enough now. My view is that I'm going to carry on watching the texts. I've got these guys behind me. I'm never going to, I think, lose interest in or faith in them as characters or in the shows that they have. Will I choose to watch the next Whedon creation? Almost certainly. Will I be tainted by these allegations? Very possibly. Will I try to make sure I don't reflect that in my criticism when I'm writing about it? Definitely. Anyway, till next time, take care. Bye. Just one last thing. If you've got any comments to make, you agree with me, you disagree with me, you want to have a bit of an online debate or whatever, then please leave some comments below and subscribe. There'll be more of this kind of stuff coming up, I hope, quite soon. Thank you very much for having stuck with it. Bye.